Welcome back to BLOCKTV. It's time now for Long Read Sunday. Crypto Twitter is a never-ending stream of information, thoughts and discussions about the world of cryptocurrency. It's a mammoth task to keep track of all of it, but to help us break it down, we're joined every week by Nathaniel Whittemore, who takes the time to boil it all down and take the pulse of the ecosystem. Every week he combines all the best of the best into his Long Read Sunday Twitter column, and Nathaniel joins us now for the show. Nathaniel, thanks so much for being with us, and a Happy New Year to you.
Hey, Happy New Year. Good to be here.
All right, so to clarify for the viewers at home, this week we're not doing the traditional countdown in a sense of a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We'll keep the numbers there, but just to help guide us, what this is a chronological look at some of the key events that you picked out for the year. And we start with your number 5, Nathaniel, coming all the way back at February 10. Take it away. What stood out to you on this auspicious date?
Sure. So, I mean, as I said in the tweet, I think, basically I went back and looked through the Long Read Sunday from every single week of the year and picked out what I thought was the most significant or representative content from that week. And this week in February was the first that really, we were off to the races, right? So we had the Quadriga CX scandal breaking, and then we had Jack taking the lightning torch, which really set up this whole tone of the Bitcoin tone of the year. And then we had this report from Coin Center, which was, there wasn't a specific event that it was tied to, but this notion of privacy as a central issue for 2019, and the idea that a cashless society, that a move to digital currencies could threaten that privacy, was obviously something that would continue to grow as an issue throughout the year, particularly in the context of the emergent phenomenon of government digital currencies. So this was, I think, a week that set up a lot of what would happen for the rest of the year.
Yeah, it certainly seemed to set a tone for how people set about. Interesting to note that we only got that tone setting, as you said, all the way in February, already a fair way into the year. Do you, just a quick look ahead, expect a similar sort of pattern this year in terms of where we're going to get that first key event of the year?
It's hard to tell. I think that there's more. If you remember, we were really at the very, very bottom of the bear market at that point. The only people really who had called it the low of the bear market were Delphi Digital and I think Joe Lubin at that point. So January was a real slog, right? It was literally crypto winter and real winter. So I think that might have been part of it. I think that there's so many more things happening this year in terms of institutional actors in the space, in terms of, big money from exchanges that are competing, in terms of obviously everything going on with government digital currencies and Libra and things like that, that I wouldn't be surprised if we're a little bit more off to the races this year.
Certainly, I hope the tone does kick off a little more friendly this year. We're 2 days in, it's already not looking too bad yet, but time will tell. All right, so let's jump ahead now to April 14th with a phrase I'll throw at you: we are all hodlonaut.
Yeah, so this was I think, interesting to me for almost a symbolic reason, right? This was a year where a lot of things happened that were effectively come down to new power entering this crypto space, right? Like if you look at the introduction of Libra, that's Facebook entering this digital currency space. If you look at obviously the response to Libra and governments trying to get involved, these are things that can potentially shift the balance of power. And I think that part of why I wanted to flag this episode is this was a moment which has happened frequently throughout the history of crypto, where the community basically said no to someone trying to exert power in a burdensome way, right? So obviously for those who weren't hanging out, Craig Wright went after Hodlnaut, an avatar Bitcoiner on Twitter, and basically threatened to sue him, or did sue him for defamation for saying, that he wasn't Satoshi. And everyone on Twitter, on crypto Twitter, basically changed their photos. Peter McCormick obviously got in a huge fight and got sued himself. And so, I think that the sum total, though, of the whole episode was this hostility to power exerting itself, that I think is one of the things that keeps this space healthy and self-protected.
Interesting to bring up that notion of back in April of power asserting itself and how that plays a role in the crypto sphere, because I'm going to jump ahead to your next one and segue into that, because come mid-July, we had a very different tone and a massive power asserting itself very actively in the space in the form of a tweet from none other than US President Donald Trump. That was a real change of pace come the middle of the year, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, and so this is, basically this is part of the response. And the next couple of these tweets that I highlighted were all the response to Libra, right? Libra was interesting because it was not something that a lot of people, there wasn't a betting pool, right? If you look at the predictions from the beginning of 2019 about what might happen this year, there was no one saying, Facebook's going to launch something. People might have been talking about Telegram and whatever, but it kind of came out of left field. And when it did, obviously, it caught everyone's attention. And among that everyone was obviously Donald Trump. And now the interesting thing about this tweet, and we talked about it then as it happened, was it felt pretty clearly written for him. Some tweets you can tell are definitely just him, stream of consciousness. This one was very much in line with the tone that we heard from other White House officials, and was really kind of setting up their argument in advance of the Libra hearings. Now, I guess the other important note on this tweet is that although nominally he was talking about Bitcoin, he really kind of wasn't. He was just setting it up to be about Libra. So, but it was, no matter what, it was definitely a remarkable moment that suggested and conveyed just how significant a shift in attention Libra brought the entire crypto space.
Something did bring attention, and I want to take a moment to highlight those Libra hearings in particular. First with David Marcus, later in the year with Mark Zuckerberg, but firstly with the David Marcus hearing, and the sort of focusing on that with, as in your next tweet you mentioned, Representative Patrick McHenry taking that chance to say that line that Bitcoin is an unstoppable force. Certainly a powerful time in the industry to hear those words coming out of a congressman.
Yeah, no, it was interesting to watch. I mean, all of these hearings, this was probably the most remarkable moment in some ways. This is the ranking Republican of this subcommittee, and he basically made the argument that governments can't build Bitcoin. Those who have tried have failed. And that it's the approach that the U.S. should take is to understand these technologies and try to understand what can be done. Now, this was a bright spot in a 6-hour hearing that was more often about using kind of the 5-minute time slots that each of these congressmen had to batter their particular pet issue or just go after Facebook for previous wrongs. But there were some pretty interesting and important moments, and I think the quote from Patrick McHenry was right at the top of that list.
Certainly, it was one to remember in a difficult slog that was those hearings and what came out of them. But of course, not all the attention could be focused on the United States for the entire year. So a term come August 25th that just rolls off the tongue, Nathaniel, that of synthetic hegemonic currency. Really one to stick with. Let's dig deeper into that. Tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, so I think, if Libra was the biggest event of the year, which I believe that it was so significant because of the response of the world to Libra, right? And so there's a couple different categories of that. The first is that obviously other world governments got really involved. And, particularly, I think it has to be said in the case of China. China immediately started visibly and publicly increasing its efforts around a digital currency. They have been, dominating the narrative basically ever since then. When you look at, the European and American responses to Libra, it is now completely couched in also China's response to Libra. So these are now kind of inextricably linked. And the questions that they're facing aren't just should Zuckerberg be allowed to do this, but what are we going to do because China's doing it and what does that mean? So, this is kind of one side is the response of other governments. Now, the other part of the response that I think that shows just how significant this was is changing almost the Overton window on the idea of the US dollar as the world's global reserve currency. And the most notable moment of that was at basically the Fed. Kansas City Fed hosts an event every year at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where they have a lot of these types of folks, Davos types basically come talk about the future of money and the future of economies. And Mark Carney, who's a Bank of England governor, suggested that perhaps the US dollar was no longer serving the world as a global reserve currency, and it should be replaced or supplemented with a synthetic hegemonic currency, which was his term, and which would be basically a joint effort of central banks to create a unit specifically for this purpose. So, it hasn't really gone anywhere since then, in some ways where we haven't heard much about it. And a cynic might say, Mark Carney was kind of on his way out of the Bank of England, or didn't get the IMF job that maybe he wanted, and so he was kind of trying to just be a firebrand a little bit. But I think that it almost doesn't matter, because the point is not so much whether there's going to be a synthetic hegemonic currency, but that you're seeing at the highest level in public people questioning the US dollar's place in the world.
Yeah, certainly a unshakable institution of the last 70-odd years, now suddenly looking a lot shakier, as it were. Whether we get that sort of global cooperation on a hegemonic currency, I'm not sure. But as you say, that Overton window has perhaps shifted, and cryptocurrencies are leading the way. Now, let's take it right to the end of the year. Just a couple of weeks ago, I remember having the conversation with you, Nathaniel, talking about Jill Carlson's article stating that crypto maybe isn't supposed to go mainstream. Controversial, no?
Yeah, so I chose this as the last inflection point of the year. In some ways, this represents all of the end of year content, right? We didn't see any, huge events happening in December or anything like that. Lots and lots of little things, lots and lots of continued growth. But the reason that I wanted to point to this is that, in some ways, that end of year content is a good way to get a sense of what big questions people are asking, where the narrative battle lines are going to be for the next year. And particularly, again, in a year where, as we've seen, as we've just gone through, so much of the story of the year is about the role of digital currencies in the world, and the role of who actually is going to be the originator of digital currencies in the future. These really big picture questions that Jill is bringing up around whether crypto is supposed to be a mainstream tool, or whether it's really about working around the systems of power and working or enabling transactions that would otherwise be censored. I think why this piece struck such a nerve is that it feels like this is really the question. And I think we're going to see a lot more conversation in the next, few weeks, few months around can something like Bitcoin, can these sort of non-sovereign, decentralized, network-based monies coexist with these digital currencies and these surveillance monies, or are they fundamentally incompatible? The gut level response, or the knee-jerk response for a lot of folks, is, oh, well, they have to be compatible, and that anything that brings attention to this space is just going to create a funnel of people finding their way into Bitcoin and into other cryptos. And maybe that's the case. However, it strikes me that the question is important to ask, and I think Jill's piece did it really well, and kicked up quite a storm of people who are now actually having this conversation.
Yeah, certainly. I think, as you said, a bit of quiet at the end of the year, a bit of a lull, as it were, no big events, gave people that time for reflection, maybe to take a look and take stock after a wild and volatile year. Perhaps stand ready and firm and launch off into 2020, hopefully to the moon, but I guess we'll see. All right, Nathaniel Whittemore, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have a look at the year that was. I look forward to the year that is and will be, and continue having our Long Read Sundays conversations here on BLOCKTV. And for those at home, make sure you stay with us at blocktv.com for all the latest in news and information. I'm Asher Westrop Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.